A great new additional tool for pivot tables in Excel 2013 is the timeline. If you take any given pivot table, so let's take the Sales Inc. 2013 pivot, which is based on the sales data for 2013, it has a pivot table and it simply lists each of the items and how many of them have been sold. So it's actually quite a long pivot table. Now, if we wanted to introduce the timeline tool here, we simply select the pivot table, go to the Pivot Table Tools ribbon, and Analyze and Insert Timeline. Now what that does is it gives you an option of all the fields in your data with dates. Now in our particular data there's only one field, but we still have to select it. OK. And then we have this floating dialog box here for the sales data. Now what you'll notice is it gives you the months and the years. Now because our data is only in 1 year, we've effectively only got 12 months to choose from, and you can click. So I've clicked on March and I'm seeing the data for March 2013. If I expand this little selection, then it will show me the sales data for March to June. Now you can see the pivot table alongside here is responding to any changes I make in the timeline, because the timeline is effectively filtering the data. I could jump right through to December. You can see the list increases massively. If I go through to February, very quiet month, the list reduces dramatically, 46 items. Whereas if I go to April and May and June, so we expand the area just by dragging the sides of it, then we have 75. If I jump right through to November, busiest month of the year, it jumps up dramatically to 180. So this is the timeline filter based on the sale date, so that's the field, and it will show you which months are being filtered. Now you can change how the timeline operates, because currently it's operating in months. We could change it to quarters, and then shows us Q1, Q2, Q3 and Q4. So I could then choose Q3, it would automatically choose the third quarter of the year. Or I could go to days, and then I can actually highlight a day spans. This is a much longer scroll bar now. Just say, oh, let's just try the end of November there, see how that looked. Or I could go to years, in which case there's only 1 year, which is November 2013, all of the data. So the filtering group you choose there will depend on really the extent of the data that you're dealing with. In our particular case, I think months work best. And then within there, you can filter by each of the broken down components, so in this case months, and you can actually expand that as a date range by dragging the sides, not just dragging across. So that's the timeline feature. Now, as well as the ability to obviously insert the timeline, you can resize the little rectangle that's being used there, obviously to suit the layout of your pivot table, and you can change the style of it. With the timeline selected, we have a timeline tools options, and you can see we can change the style to a different style. There's a number of built-in ones, quite like green. You could even go through the process of creating your own timeline style there, control each of the sections. I'm going to stay with dark green. And we can change the height and the width, which we've just changed by dragging the size, but you can do it physically here to say a physical size that you would like. 1.6 inches high. Let's go for 6 inches wide. Now the timeline can overlap your pivot table and still affect it. Obviously you just can't quite see the results. July was a very quiet month. And we can decide which parts we need. If we don't want the time level, we can take that off. If we don't want the scroll bar, we can take that off. If we don't want the header, we can take that off. And if we don't want the label, we can take that off. So you can customize the timeline to some degree based on color and the parts of the timeline that you don't want. But whatever is selected in this timeline is effectively acting as a filter for the data held in the pivot table. So this is, instead of really putting a report level filter up here, this is nice graphical use. And it's much neater and nicer and gives you more flexibility because I can select 6 months very easily, whereas in the drop down I have to click each month. So that's the timeline feature, and will work on any pivot table that contains underlying data with date values. So the date values don't necessarily need to be used in the pivot table, but the underlying data must contain date values really for the timeline to make any sense.